Welcome to the Dental School Guide podcast, your ultimate destination for all things dentistry. I'm Dr. Tanner Townsend, your guide through the complex world of dental education. Join us as we uncover the secrets of acing dental school admissions, navigating residency programs, and exploring career opportunities. Please share and enjoy. Real quick, just wanted to make all you pre-dental students out there aware of a resource. If you've ever been worried about getting into dental school or are wanting to get into that school of your dreams, then you definitely want to check out a program called Dental School Guide. In the program, we walk you through how to save money, time, and heartache when applying to dental school. There's so much fluff out there when it comes to resources for getting into school, and we are streamlining all of that. With our comprehensive digital course, expert mentorship, and personalized application review services, you'll have everything you need to stand out to admission committees. Take advantage of this amazing resource that will help you increase your chances of getting into dental school. You'll want to check out dentalschoolguide.com. Check it out. Welcome back to the Dental School Guide podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Tanner Townsend, and today we have Dr. Colombo and Victoria from UNLV again today with us. And we're going to be talking about some specific topics, in particular the DAT, and then what we can do to improve our application if we need to reapply or during the cycle. So guys, welcome back to the podcast. We're glad to have you on again.
Great to be here, Dr. Townsend. Thank you for inviting us back.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Well, we are super excited. You guys were filled with great knowledge, and we're excited to hear what you guys have to say today. So to start off, we're just going to jump right into this. We're going to talk about the DAT first. Dr. Colombo, you are an expert in the DAT and kind of helping break down what the DAT really means, because a lot of students, we see it on Student Doctor Network, we see it on Reddit, those posts that are like subtle flexes of, hey, I got this score, should I get in? Do you really think I have a chance? And then other scores are not quite as good, and they're asking for advice. And I think that's sometimes the wrong way to go about it. But give us your opinion on the DAT and kind of run us through what you guys look at and the true meaning of the DAT score.
Okay. As you mentioned, I am also a huge fan of the pre-dental subreddit. I sometimes kind of haunt that, and I think about half it's interesting because it's quite seasonal, like what things you see on there. So during the height of application cycles, you see like, oh my gosh, this is my DAT score, I'm freaking out. And then just after Christmas, you start to see those nifty flow charts that they have of like, this is how many schools I applied to, this is how many I got in, and everyone's always like, stats, what were your stats, what were your stats, what were your stats, right? But I would say about half the posts overall, that's not quantified, that's just my feeling, right? So don't count them and tell me my percentages are off. But I feel like a ton of those posts on there are like, here's my DAT score that I took. Is this good or not good, basically? And I think there's two things I want to talk about with that, pretty much. And one of which is because the way the DAT is scored, it's a ranked percentile test. You're basically like ranked and scored against everyone else who took the test at that kind of given period of time. You kind of should be able to interpret where you're sitting in terms of your score and how everyone else scored. The second question about how competitive it is depends a lot on the context of your application. And by context of the application here, I'm going to mean the game, that famous game that we talk about of like in-state applicants for their state schools, out-of-state applicants, and then of course private schools, that kind of third group of dental schools that are out there. And sort of where you are and where you're applying from and what schools you're applying to are all going to make a difference in terms of how competitive you are. Okay, so the first thing I'll say is, and I don't want to patronize anyone, but I do have this feeling that even though we've all been taking standardized tests our whole life, we don't always have a good handle on like what percentile means in terms of like a ranked standardized exam, right? And so really, I think the easiest way to think about it is if a percentile score is your place in a room of 100 people who took the test ranked in terms of performance from best to least, right? And so usually what they'll do is they'll have everyone take this exam, they'll weight it and modify it, throw out questions, weight some questions more than others in ways that are totally mysterious and known only unto them. I mean, they're not really going to give us that info, right? And then what they'll do is they'll say, okay, the top score is pegged up here, the bottom scores are pegged down here. We're going to rank everyone in between those in terms of how they did relative to those scores, and then we're going to assign what we're familiar with the DAT scores, like your 18s, your 20s, your 25s, all that stuff. We're going to put percentile rankings on those numbers. We're going to peg those numbers to percentile rankings. And so the next point to make there is when we talk about percentiles, we're usually going to talk about medians and not means. So we're going to talk about the score that occurs in the middle, not necessarily the average. I mean, we could talk about the average, but really we're going to talk about the score that's in the middle. So in our room of 100 people, the median score would be the performance of person number 50, right? They did better than half the people in the room, worse than half the people in the room. They are right in the middle, okay? And so what they'll do is they'll peg the median score to a numbered score. And that score these days for the academic average is around 18. So if you score around about 18 on the DAT as an academic average, you've done about better than half the people who took it and worse than half the people who took it. Now, if you go back about 10 years, that number would have looked more like 17 or so, but there's been upward creep, as we all can see, basically, in the DAT. I mean, you all are getting better at taking the DAT, right? And so I think some of that's playing into this supposed rescoring, renumbering of the DAT. I don't have a ton of information about that yet, but they are going to twiddle the way in which they score and rank the DAT in the future. But for now, 18, that's your middle of the road score there. Some sections in the DAT will be have the median score pegged to different numbers, right? So reading comprehension, they tend to peg that a little bit higher. The 50th percentile score is around 20-ish, somewhere in there. Quantitative reasoning, sometimes a little lower, 16, 17 in there. And so my sources for all those numbers are on that handbook for the DAT that the ADA puts out, basically, right? So it'll give you, for various testing years, I think there's data up to 2022, 2023 rounds. They'll show you what the median scores were, the cumulative median that scored a certain score. But pretty much, to sum all that up, 18 academic average, you're sitting right in the middle of the pack. So if you've got an 18 academic average, you can look around and say, well, at least I did better than half the people who took the exam, but I didn't do as well as the other half of the people who took the exam. It is quite literally a middling score, we would say. So that's kind of where that sits. And in terms of competitiveness, that's a second question, because there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of context that sits on that, right? And so a fact is this, generally speaking, you usually have your best shot at getting into the in-state school where you are a resident, right? So this is great if you're sitting in a state that has a few dental schools that are not at the top end of competitiveness, that are state schools, and you can qualify as a resident to those schools. That's amazing for you, right? If you are sat in a state that does not have a dental school, that's hard. And if you're sat in a state, what I call the California, New York, and I guess I can throw Michigan problem in there, it applies other places, but you have state schools that are very competitive. They're at the high end of the competition in terms of getting in. So California, your state schools are UCLA and UCSF, and also you've got a hugely populated state. So you've got 2 state schools for 30-odd million people. You've got a lot of demand for those schools nationwide, and they're your only in-state option. So California, I'm sorry. Michigan, I'm sorry you got one, and it's maybe arguably the best dental school in the country. And I say arguably because there's some scope to talk about, but Michigan, great dental school, right? It's very competitive. And then New York, you got Sunny, and you've got Buffalo, right? These are really hard to get into, right? So, or they can be very competitive. But generally speaking, the reason that you've got the best chance at getting into your in-state school as an in-state candidate is because generally state schools like UNLV, we do the same thing. We want to have a certain proportion of any incoming class be from our state or have significant ties to our state, right? So there's a smaller pool because there's only so many people who are applying as in-state candidates, and there's more seats relative to the number of those people. Statistics are a little bit less competitive. Now, that's not to say not competitive, because it's, I would say we're getting, and Victoria can chime in on this,
Yeah.
I think it's getting tighter. I don't think it's getting looser out there. So in terms of raw stats, right, it's not getting looser. So, but you've still got smaller pool, more seats, right? As an out-of-state candidate, you've got the whole nation competing for a lesser proportion of seats. So you're kind of up against it as an out-of-state candidate. That's not to say it's impossible by any means, but just the stat requirements are higher because we've got all of the US and indeed all of Canada applying for those out-of-state seats, because we can have Canadian applicants naturally for American dental school seats.
Yeah,
and they apply, international, they apply as out-of-state candidates effectively, right? So big pool, fewer seats, higher stat requirements. Now the private schools, they kind of do what they're going to do. and they have the flexibility to kind of, because there are no in-state and out-of-states, they can take who they like, they can take who they feel fits their mission, they can cherry pick good candidates, they can say, oh, no, our goal is to give people access who come from non-traditional backgrounds, etc. They can kind of set that mission to whatever level they want to. And you'll see that if you look at the average admitted stats to the private schools, right? So obviously we've got like private schools like Columbia at the upper end. They're like super competitive to get into. And then you've got schools that have more flexibility in your kind of admitting stats, right? And we all know what those are. Like some of the newer, if you like quotations, like dental schools. And that's not to disparage them at all, right? Like perfectly good educations to be had from there, but just they can be more flexible on the kind of some of the stats sometimes and what they're admitting. So for those, if you want to know where you rank up with those, you can kind of look at their average admitted stats, right? And so on a kind of final note, average admitted stats, don't let that freak you out, right? So if you're sitting there with an 18 on the DAT and you've got a reasonably good GPA, so you say you've got like a 3.5, 3.6 science GPA and you're sitting there with an 18 on the DAT, you're right in the middle of the pack. That might be competitive for your in-state school if you're applying as an in-state resident, and I say might in very bold letters there because it depends where you are. But you might not be as competitive as an out-of-state candidate and as for a private school, kind of potpourri, right? Look at their average admitted stats. Our average admitted for this last cycle here at UNLV, we had an academic average of around 22 on the DAT. 21, 22. Yeah, it's 21 point something. If we round it up, we would get to 22, right? So academic average, which that's about 85th, 90th percentile if you start looking at the raw numbers in terms of people who took the DAT. But I wouldn't want that to discourage anyone because, again, we switched from talking about median to mean there. So that's the average score. So some people we see and some people we admit here, they totally blow out like the total science section. They get like 30s on the total. They're in like the top 1% of people who took the exam. They've got almost a perfect score on total science, or they're up there in like, as you move through those percentiles, you'll see that like anything above like 22, the slice of it's like two people, one person, so like 93rd percentile, 95th percentile. The slices get very thin as you move up through the 20s, obviously, right? And if you think about it, that'll make sense to you, right? Because there's fewer and fewer people achieving those very high scores almost by definition. But yeah, that means that some people we've admitted have got those super high scores, and that's weighting up the average significantly. So when we say, oh, our average admitted, for the sake of argument, is 22, that means we've admitted some people with a lot higher than 22. It also means we've admitted people lower than a 22. Okay, so that doesn't mean you're totally sunk, but I think it does bear some serious consideration if you're sitting at that kind of 18. And I mention 18 a lot because it is 50th percentile, but that's kind of the cutoff where you're like, should I retake or not, right? If you're sitting on like a 19 or 20, you're like, oh, I feel like I could have done better, but I think I'm just going to go for it. If you're at like a 16 or 17, you're definitely like, Dr. Townsend's probably the first to tell you like, yeah, think about retaking. But that 18, it depends, right? You're kind of right on the cusp of it. And it kind of comes down to like you as an individual, like I don't know, where you're sitting, what your chances might be, how acceptable you find risk basically for a given cycle, that kind of thing. Because you can definitely get in with those scores in a lot of places, but then you can definitely not get in at a lot of places. So I keep mentioning 18 because it's like that liminal, right on the edge score. And so when you're making that consideration, should I retake when you're sitting in that ballpark, remember the thing to think about, you're in the middle of the room. Like right number 50, half the people did better than you. So you got to be thinking like, okay, where am I trying to apply? How's my GPA? How's my other peripheral stuff sitting around my application? How much do I fit if it's a private school, whatever mission they're saying they're trying to fulfill, that kind of thing. So that's kind of my 2 points about the DAT there. That's what I've got to say about it. We are always open to questions, consultations, etc. if applicants want to reach out to myself, or Victoria primarily really does a lot of advising in her capacity here. So we can kind of give you the straight dope on like what your DAT is looking like in your specific context. We love to talk to our candidates here. I can't say that about every dental school. We do like to talk to applicants here. It helps everyone, I think.
No, 100% agree. It's super cool that you guys are so transparent, and that was incredibly thorough for the DAT. I love that, Dr. Colombo.
Well, I'm glad I got through it, but I hope that makes sense. It's a little bit statisticky, but there we are. We're talking about percentiles, rankings, and median scores. There's no way around it.
Yeah, there's no way around it, and there's no way it's necessary for the schools to like be able to rank you. I mean, all the universities are so different in terms of difficulty level. It makes it hard to standardize for sure. So,
Yeah, and I want to kind of throw in on that. I think that some people are sometimes embarrassed of their scores or their performance, and they don't want to talk about it because of that. But I just want to say that from my philosophy about dental school admissions, which again is possibly not everyone's, but I don't like to talk about applications in terms of being good or bad. I like to think of them in terms of being ready and not ready, right? And from our
mhm,
perspective, it's not like, oh my gosh, I only want people that have good stats because I care about good stats for good stats sakes. I what we're trying to do, Victoria and I here, we're trying to look in basically a crystal ball, and we're trying to say, okay, how are you going to perform in dental school? And yes, like you can
mhm.
see in the ADA's thing, we've done internal studies about it. There are different strengths of correlation with different segments of the DAT in terms of clinical outcomes in dental school, like those clinical classes in terms of academic, like didactic class outcomes. But basically, the higher your DAT score, the more likely you are to perform in dental school. And even on the weaker correlated ones, it's like, yeah, any given section, the better you do on any given section, the better you're probably going to do in dental school, right? So that's our crystal ball we have. We have how well have you run the marathon and done those science classes? How long can you lay down solid grades in hard science classes over time? And then also, how can you sit in a room and take a pretty grueling exam about stuff you've already theoretically seen before and spit out the correct answers, right? And so that kind of, to use the overused phrase, is what it is, right? Like, I mean, it doesn't tell us anything about who you are as a person. It doesn't say whether you'd even be a good dentist or not. But what we're trying to see is like, okay, are you going to perform well in dental school based on this very limited and imperfect information we have about you? Because what I don't want to do as someone involved in admissions for dental school is bring an unready candidate forward. Because for us, I mean, if you want to spend $20,000 between September and January, there's way more fun ways to do it than the
Yeah.
first semester of dental school, right? By which I mean, I don't want to bring anyone here to repeat a semester because it's a waste of your money, time, effort, emotional stuff. I mean, it's like we have to have difficult talks sometimes, and of like, you know what? You got to repeat a year, you got to repeat a semester, and sometimes that is the best thing for the candidate. And some of our best students have had to repeat a year, and they go on to be really successful. So I'm not saying you can't be successful with that, but I would prefer to bring in people who are ready for that first year experience, who are going to pass it successfully and not have to repeat, right? I want them to be ready coming in. And some applications just aren't ready. And some of the best predictors we have for that are those stats, admittedly harvested in an imperfect way. But that's what we've got to work with. So that's what we
Yeah.
work with.
No, I think that's a great way to look at it in terms of the ready versus not ready. And so, Victoria, the students that come that are not ready, what do you have for those students that like help them get over the hump for future years to move from not ready to ready?
So we kind of look at all kind of components of the application first and foremost. Very much a holistic approach. The first thing we typically see on an application be the metrics. So we're going to look at the GPAs, we're going to look at the DAT scores. That's always the first kind of point of conversation with the applicant. So if the GPAs are rocky, if they're rough, if they're definitely, I would say, below a 3.0,
There's
then there are
a lot of
different
questions
means
there.
of ways to remediate that. So if an applicant, there's usually two options. So if an applicant is interested, it's really on them. I just give them the options, but the one option would be to look at a post-bac option. So there's two types of post-bacs traditionally you'd find across colleges in the US. One would be one for career changers. So we do get applicants sometimes that, have a degree in engineering and they need to do the prereqs. In that case, you would want to be a career changer and look for post-bacs that are geared towards that.
Hmm.
Their other options would be, you might see it called academic record enhancer type of post-bac where they can really kind of not so much retake, but take courses that can benefit their GPA. And typically on the AppSAS application, we would see a separate post-bac GPA that they would have done after their undergraduate career. So we would have those two options. So you can do either career changer if you're in a position where you've never completed any of the prereqs and you're changing your job to something completely different. And then there's an academic record enhancer, which can help your GPA. The other option, which would be more time consuming and definitely more expensive, would be a master's degree. And again, I can't speak for other dental schools, but here at UNLV, if we have a student who did a post-bac or if we had a student who did a graduate degree option and they did did extremely well in that, we're kind of more inclined to look at those GPAs in comparison to the previous ones.
Yeah.
We see that upward trajectory there.
I'm going to see like a post-bac where you've taken like a ton of upper division sciences. And again, as Victoria very clearly explained there, very well explained there, like some of them will be like self-contained, here's a certificate. Some of them are just going to be, oh, here's a recommended course of study of like all these upper division ones. Honestly, if you got A's, maybe a couple of B's in there, if you got a solid GPA in there, I'm totally more than willing to say like, great, you know, the past is the past. We're churning out those grades in science classes. It seems reputable. There's enough of them there. There's enough substance here. There's enough credit hours. Great, right? I would also say that like a master's is totally an option. I'm always inclined to tell candidates to take the cheapest path in terms of money to get that result, because we kind of view a really and I say this with some hesitation, but a well-rounded and very complete post-bac, I would view it as equivalent to a master's degree in terms of GPA resuscitation, right? They're equally valuable to me in terms of what we're trying to assess, right? And that's like, can you pull the grades, basically, in the science classes?
Well, one thing I do want to mention for the graduate degree option, so if you are going to pursue that route, one, make sure that the grading system is a letter grading system.
Oh, yeah.
So there are a lot of graduate degrees out there that are simply pass-fail or satisfactory, unsatisfactory. And the problem with that is on a DAT ATSAS, they do not calculate those grades because it's not an actual letter grade. So I've had students that have completed graduate degree programs and they're like, why is my GPA a 0 on ATSAS? And I'm like, because they don't calculate, you know, pass grades. It actually doesn't equate to anything.
Can I ask you to comment on something, Victoria?
Sure.
A commonly asked question. Where does a post-bac GPA end up in the ATSAS application? Do we see it separately?
We do. Yeah, it's on like a completely different page away from that very first page on the application. So we do have to do some digging for it.
It's a special section, though. It's not a graduate. There's a graduate GPA section. There's a bachelor's degree section for GPA. And there's the post-bac section, which is courses you've taken after the completion of your bachelor's degree, but not as a formal graduate degree. So that exists on there. We see it. You don't have to like tell us, right? Like we see it.
So here's a follow-up question to that. There are the career changers, the academic enhancer programs for post-bacs, and then there are students that I know of that just go back to school and like, hey, I'm going to go back to XYZ school in my community. They don't have a formal program. I'm just going to take all these classes. How is that viewed by you guys? Is it viewed any different than a formal post-bac that's kind of more structured?
I mean, we're typically okay with that. Again, we can't speak for other dental schools, but I mean, we don't have a formal post-bac at UNLV. So we actually, Dr. Colombo and I actually created for our UNLV students here a set of classes that are upper division science courses that are kind of apart from the prerequisites that you can take to actually help your GPA. Because the one thing too on ATSAS, a lot of students want to retake, you know, OChem if they have a C, you know, keep that C and move on because it will actually hurt your GPA by retaking it multiple times opposed to like taking immunology or histology and getting a really good grade in that course. We actually built a kind of unofficial informal post-bac, and we actually worked with our advising center over on our main campus to help implement that. So
they've got the list.
We're fine with it. If they do like hey, I graduated but I want to go back and maybe my GPA is like a 3.3 and I want to take like a semester of really hard, you know, really hardcore science classes, they can go ahead and do that because the GPA will show up. And sometimes I've seen it update on the undergraduate GPA, and then sometimes it appears on the post-bac option. So it really kind of varies where it falls. It depends on how they verify it on their end.
But we can see what you've done, basically.
We can.
So we definitely can see that. And so I think that can affect people's choices sometimes. But know out there that there is a post-bac GPA slot. We can definitely see the cumulative GPA for those post-bachelor's degree finished science classes that you may have taken. I want to throw in a quick appeal at this point too. You're speaking about like non-traditional students, career changers. UNLV, we love you guys. We love non-traditional students. Hygienists, if you want to come to dental school, come talk to us. We love a dental hygienist in our program. We have a smattering. We would always love to hear more from them. Career changers from other fields, we'd love to work with you. Mature students, non-traditional students, we absolutely don't have any of those biases here. We absolutely actively want those students,
Yeah,
or at
for
least
sure.
want those applicants, and we are more than happy to talk to you about things you might need to do in order to like complete prereqs or resuscitate something from the distant past, or and so forth, right? But some of that stuff's case by case, but we are more than happy to talk about it. So please, if you're out there, you're listening to this, you're thinking about a career change, you are a non-traditional student, age is quite literally just a number here, right? Like, we don't care about it, right? Like, come to school. We've got students that range from 50 odd to, their 20s here. We do have students who are older. We love it. We think it's great to stabilize a class in some ways,
For
honestly.
sure.
Yeah, sometimes having a little bit more mature student that's been around the block is kind of nice to have in the class to even things out.
So come talk to us. That's what I would say. We are more than happy to help facilitate those career changes, non-traditional pathways, when we can.
That is great. So Victoria, back to the not ready student. So that's kind of what you do if you have a 3.0 or lower, or you have some poor grades. I loved your advice on don't even retake that C. It's just going to hurt your GPA. I think that's something that we don't often hear, but it's very valid. But in terms of other areas of the application where you're not ready, obviously the DAT is pretty obvious. If you score below like the 18, if you're a 17, 16 academic average, we need to consider retaking that. Now, sometimes we see on, and this is for question for both of you, for the DAT, let's say we've got a student that's got an 18 average and they did really well in a couple sections, they get like a 15 on a section or a 16 or a 14, whereas that one section that's just dragging them down, or two sections, but the average is the median.
Right. I mean, if we saw like a 13, a 14, a 15, we're going to highly recommend that you retake it. Not only to be competitive for our institution, but other institutions as well. It's kind of a hard sell for the admissions committees in general, and I can probably say that broadly across so many dental schools. I would recommend, I mean, we don't have a good prep that we recommend, but I would say get behind a good prep course, really focus. One thing about our program, we will take the highest DAT scores out of your last 2 attempts, as long as your scores are valid and within 3 years. So let's say if you did it the first time and your QR was a 13 and you're like, everything else was good, just that one score brought you down, and then you retake it and you get like an 18 on your QR and your other scores have increased, we would use that 18 over the 13.
Up the 18 in for the 13 and take the highest of the last 2 attempts, provided they fall within the 3-year eligibility of the scores, right?
So we'll do whatever to help make that applicant more competitive for the admissions committee.
Well, we indeed here, if you've got any section below a 15, we're not considering your application. I mean, that's we do have a hard.
It's across the board.
I guess if you I guess we can say that, right? Like, that's kind of that's where we're at. We're not, your application's not going to proceed any further. We got to have a floor somewhere, and that's our floor, is any section lower than a 15. I would say this too, when you're thinking about the application cycle, right? Obviously, we know that mid-December it's not the 15th this year, isn't it? Is it the 17th this year? It's like whatever business day is closest to the 15th, right? Yeah, it's like that business day. So like it's mid-December anyway. The first day we can make offers. 13th, yeah. So we fact check us there, guys. But it's around that time. So we really have our first round decision making, as I know many other schools do, and it's going to be end of November, early December, right? We're going to have our big first round picks at around that time, and then we're going to sit on them, obviously. Like, we're going to know before you know by a couple of weeks usually, like, who's going to get an offer, but we are not allowed to make those offers until then. Even if you're an in-state student and you're sitting on some of those lower DAT scores, understand that that's a way to kind of ask to be on a wait list or not picked in that first round. Now, that's not to say you won't ever get in, but like, obviously the first round is like, wow, these are like the best candidates. These candidates have very few flaws or none at all in their application. We're very excited about them. We're very excited about these out of states. We're very excited about these in states. We're going to make first round offers, and we're going to come back to some of these other ones. Right now, again, you'll hear people say like, oh, I totally got in with like a 17 or a 16 in that section. And yes, absolutely possible. The likelihood of you being a first round pick like that, though, is somewhat reduced if there's like a big hole in your DAT score there, because people will be like, oh, on the admissions committee, like, oh, cool, well, we can always come back to them, but like these other applicants don't have that pit in their DAT score, right? And so like, somebody might even stand up, and a lot of how you get into dental school honestly is advocacy, right? So someone in the admissions committee will be like, I love this candidate, I don't care about their 16 in quantitative reasoning, I loved them, I thought their interview was great, I have to have them. Even then, it can be like, cool, we'll stick them on a wait list for you because nobody else is getting behind that 15 or 16 on the quantitative reasoning right now. And then many times, right, wait lists shift, wait lists move, all that stuff. That person will end up with an offer, and then we'll say something on Reddit like, well, I totally got in with a 16. But then it's like, well, when did you get in, man? Like when did that happen, right? And so that's one caveat I would put on some of that. It's definitely not a death knell for your application if you have a section that's lower, but it's like, it's a little hole that like, well, when are you going to get an offer? I know everyone wants to get that offer like on mid-December, the first round offers, right? So
I love that. That's a great answer. So let's say the candidate's not ready in other areas of the application, excuse me. So the DAT, GPA, competitive.
Sure.
But other aspects are missing. How important are those aspects in terms of readiness for you guys?
I think too, maybe they're lacking in dental experience. I mean, you don't have to have it, but for sure, like the admissions committee loves to see dental experience. And we always feel that students that had maybe hygiene experience or lab experience or dental assisting experience, it looks really great on your application. And it's always a smooth transition, I feel like, for those applicants to go into clinic in the future. So if they don't have any dental experience, I'm like, hey, if you're not going to get in this year, look into getting a job. I'm not sure where you live. Check with your state. Maybe you can get on the job training. Do you have to have a license? Do you maybe can get into a lab somewhere? Do your research on that. Other things I would say, like, is your shadowing pretty limited? You know, something for me is a red flag if like they applied, you know, in June and they only did shadowing in that May.
Yeah, that's a huge red flag.
You know, it's kind of red flag. I'm like, is there a commitment to dentistry there? How bad do you want this? You've only shadowed for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
How much did you learn from there?
So
do you really want to be here, you know?
I have kind of a hot take on shadowing, actually.
Yeah.
About this
Hit me
point.
with the hot
Shadowing,
take.
Victoria, I agree with everything that Victoria just said. Like, we need to see some shadowing because we definitely need to see that you've gone and had a look at the profession, basically, right? That you have seen what you're getting yourself into.
But also get like varied experiences.
Yeah,
you know, it's
sure.
really more beneficial for the applicant to look at like, what does an endodontist do? What does an orthodontist do?
I think that's very valuable. And I think further value there too is like, okay, that person you're shadowing, I think everyone gets caught up in the, oh, what cool stuff are they doing? But no. You're good. That guy's going to be your boss, or that woman is going to be who you work for and who's paying your paycheck very often when you're an early associate out of dental school or whatever you're doing after dental school, right? So I always wish that people shadowing would like have their eye on like what it looks like to work in that structured environment, because most graduates nowadays not going to go off and hang their own shingle and have their own practice right away. I mean, if you did, more power to you, right? But it's not super a reality these days for a lot of cases. So you're going to have a boss. You're going to be an associate for someone. That person you're shadowing, very likely, that's like your boss. Like, so get a look at different kinds of bosses. Get a look at different kinds of mentors, because that's like some seeds for your future you need to start putting away, and also to see what they do. But I would say, like, don't get caught up in like the day-to-day stuff. I mean, you know, that's important, but also like be looking at how the kinds of people working in dentistry, start getting familiar with the kinds of environments where you can work and thrive and learn, and the kind of environments where you cannot, right? So I think that's one thing. My kind of hot take though, I think shadowing, like I said, definitely important. I think if you're up to like 200 hours in shadowing or something, I'm kind of like, honestly, I don't think that's realistic for everyone, because you need to get paid. People need to pay rent.
Yeah.
People need to, some people cannot afford to take 200 hours and follow someone around for free. So what I say instead is like, you know, do your shadowing, get your like 30, 40, 50 hours of shadowing, then work hard to get a job in a dental practice, even if it's doing like front desk stuff, dental assisting, literally anything, even sanitation and emptying garbage cans in a dental office. If you can get that, you are like in the environment, you're getting paid, which is like key, right? Like, because we have a lot of our students, they're like working through undergrad. I mean, it's not like they can't just dawdle off for like hundreds of hours and work for free or volunteer, right? So I acknowledge that it needs to be there, but like get that work experience, get paid for your time if you can. And then very often too, even if you're just working the front desk doing patient records and calls and stuff, the dentist is going to know that you want to go to dental school. They're going to take an interest in you more often than not. You're going to get that inbuilt mentoring and also be able to pay your rent. So that's kind of how I feel about shadowing. Is I like, as Victoria kind of said, dental experience that you're getting paid for if you can. much more
It's very valuable.
than like hundreds. Because I often see on Reddit, well, I've got like 500 hours of shadowing. What's the problem? And I was like, that's great for that person, but I wouldn't say that I look at only the shadowing hours. I'd be like, well, this person only has like 30 hours of shadowing, but they've worked as a dental assistant for a year. I'm like, they know everything that has happened in that year, right? So
For
great,
sure.
right? And they got paid, which is nice.
And it goes back to like, just like you said, like how much are you really gaining out of that 200 hours of shadowing? You're just watching, where the assistant's in there doing it with it, or the front desk is making the insurance calls, or whatever the case may be. It's just a totally different ballgame.
Yeah.
So.
Well, if they're applying broadly, I know there are schools that have like set requirements for shadowing. I mean, for us, we really don't.
Yeah, I can't speak for everyone. Yeah, I know that there are schools. If it's
excessive, I mean, that's fine. If you had the time to do that, great. But I also feel like if, like I said, if they shadowed like only 2 weeks right before the application was submitted.
Yeah, I agree with that.
It's always, for us, a little bit of a red flag.
How long have you been thinking about this for, you know?
No, I think that's excellent. All right, well, any other pieces of advice for those applications that aren't ready? Anything else that kind of jumps out to you that you guys are typically like, oh, that's a red flag whenever I see that on the application?
I mean, personal statements, definitely make it about yourself, about your personal narrative. You don't have to reiterate your resume and your personal statement. It should be all about you and your journey and why you want to be a dentist and what led you down that pathway. So we don't need to say like, oh, I shadowed so-and-so and I worked at this office, because like we already read that. Like,
yeah, we know who your uncle is
before,
or whatever. We know, right? Like the dental world is so small. It's like, we know your family. We know that your family's in dentistry in town. We know them, right? Like you don't have to name drop.
Yeah.
You know, I think that you can relate personal experiences about like, oh, this dentist really helped me out in my early life, like that kind of thing, or like, this is why I'm interested. Here's a good one. As your application is progressing through, don't be rude to the people who answer the phones to you in our admissions office. This one, I actually would go so far as to say this probably costs a person or two a spot every single year that I've done this. Is like somebody calls up and is very brusque or very rude to our hardworking staff. And like, honestly, our staff are very hardworking because they wear a lot of hats, right? They're not just dedicated to only doing admissions. They run a lot of student affairs stuff for our current students, and they do a lot of admissions. And it's like, when you're calling up kind of like demanding your consumer rights because you feel like you've paid a whole lot in application fees, which, by the way, we don't see most of your application fees. We see the supplementals, but the ADIA ADSAS, who's doing all the work to verify the transcripts and stuff, takes all of the application fee, right? So when you call up going like, well, I paid you like hundreds of dollars to look at my application. Why haven't you done it yet? Why isn't the process moving forward? I understand you're anxious. I think expressing anxiety is much better than expressing righteous outrage. So don't do that. It doesn't help you, because they tell us, and then they're like, very sweetly, oh, and what was your name? And then they pass that right to Victoria. And if Victoria's like, this one gets like the red flag, we're about done discussing. I mean, I'm not going to let anyone in here who has like been rude to the office staff, because it just doesn't bode well. You know what I mean?
It translates back into the clinic. It translates into the didactic.
Problematic, right? And so we don't love all that. So,
be kind, be patient.
Yeah, it is a process. I know that it feels like your application falls into a black hole and we don't consider it, but it's such a long process, and there's a lot of timelines internally that we're working on, and we're often thinking about admissions. I mean, 85% of Victoria's job full-time is centered around admissions, and the other stuff should be about admissions, just what she gets roped into with student affairs, right? Like, and stuff like that. But we do think about it like every day, basically. It's just there's timelines in place, and we have to wrangle a whole committee of like a dozen faculty who also have day jobs, like, together to get them to make these decisions, shuffle things around, that kind of thing. So, you know, we are still thinking about you. Don't feel like you're in a black hole. And the other thing I would say is you can communicate to us. I can't speak for other schools. Some schools don't want to talk with you, but we at UNLV really do want to talk to you. We would love to give you any kind of advising. We can even try to keep you updated in terms of a timeline, but please don't call every week, because it doesn't move that quickly, right?
Yeah.
But please reach out. That's what I would say. Reach out to us. We love to communicate. Sorry, Victoria. potentially
No,
open
fine.
the floodgates. But that's a lot of Victoria's advising role. We wanted her because she had that strong advising background for a lot of pre-health professions at her previous job, and so we wanted her here just for that, just for the applicants. Well, and so that's what we got, happily, right? So
yeah, I think I told you guys this last time, but you guys are one of the few schools that is so open to advising on that, which I think is incredible. Kudos to you guys for having that open line of communication with the applicants, because I think
we're at UNLV itself as a minority serving institution. We feel centrally as a university like that we're really about educational access for non-traditional students. Sometimes, I mean, obviously traditional students too, right? We're a big university, first gen students. We want people to access education. We want people to come here, and I think some of that and accomplish their goals in life, and I think some of that obviously is going to bleed through to dental school and our admission process here. Obviously, we do have academic standards because, again, it goes back to not ready, right? And I don't want to bring anyone here who's not going to succeed. Every candidate we admit is precious to us. We want them all to succeed. We don't want anyone to come here and blow a bunch of money and time and all that and have to repeat years and stuff. That's never the goal. There's no weeding going on. But I think some of that mission does bleed through up here. We do want to give those non-traditional students, we do want to give those first-gen students, we do want to give those students from different backgrounds, as well as students from our more traditional backgrounds, a shot at accomplishing their life goals. And for that small minority of people, that seems to be dentistry. So here, for that very small subset of the world who like teeth, here we are, right? And so that's, I think, some of what informs a lot of our process is that our, if you like, mothership institution really values some of that stuff.
I love that. Well, hey, you guys, thank you once again for coming on the show again to discuss a little bit more specifically about the application. I think it's been really insightful, excellent things that I think a lot of students have not heard before. So I think a lot of our listeners are going to gain some really valuable insights out of this. So thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Dr. Colombo, for coming on the show once again. And that is it for today's episode of the Dental School Guide podcast. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you
very much.
Take care.
That's all for today's episode of the Dental School Guide podcast. We hope you've gained valuable insights and inspiration to fuel your journey into dentistry. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more expert advice, inside tips, and engaging discussions. If you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a review. It would mean the world to us. Until next time, keep smiling, keep striving, and remember, your dental dreams are closer than you think. Thanks for tuning in to the Dental School Guide podcast.